when it's 78 degrees on a Wednesday night class.
In the summers at night, Jan will put it, has to have it on 65.
You better watch it. She just walked in, so whatever you're about to say.
I take that back. It's 69.
65 is including.
You would die in my house.
Why?
In our bedroom.
See?
Really?
Taking what?
59.
See, 65, don't.
Well, I do. I sleep in long sleeve pants and long sleeve shirts.
Well, see, I'd be fine with that under the covers, but then you got to get out from under the covers at some point.
Yeah, no.
I would,
See, don't complain.
oh,
And he doesn't use no.
well, now, we do also have a box fan.
It's like a campfire over there on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We do have a box fan in addition to that moment on it. So, I get up in the morning, and, I mean, it's just.
We don't set it quite that cold in the summer, but like right now, like heat was 70.
Well, yeah, that's a different cold though. I mean, but that's cold. What we said,
66 and
It'd be that first step out of the bed in the morning, take the covers off.
in the
That's,
winter, what's it, 65, we put
When
it
you
in
get the
60.
bathroom floor, it's tight.
What do you put it in the summer?
6 degrees.
I try to say I
Okay, well,
don't,
that's
I don't know that.
a couple degrees, yeah. That's a different cold than winter, because you're forcing air.
Yeah.
I had to get one of those diverters that brought, but that thing was right above me going right now.
okay, y'all, yesterday I don't know if it was just Jincy's women's Bible group or small group, but they had their Dirty Santa, and Jincy won the big prize, so I thought it'd be festive today. We have a new ornament for our tree, but I thought we needed it in the room today, so. Danny Sorrell at prom. It's Danny Sorrell.
prom. His prom.
I know it's small, but if you can just appreciate the festive nature of it.
Oh, that looks 70s. Maybe 80s, but it looks 70s.
So whichever of the ladies put that in the Dirty Santa pot,
82.
they win.
82.
82? You actually know what year that picture was taken?
If that was his prom,
Okay.
Are y'all the same age?
he was 1 year ahead of me.
I assume that was prom. I mean, I don't know, it could be some other time that he gets dressed up in a red tuxedo.
A white sport coat, so.
With the red bow tie?
Yeah, that's.
That or he was like parking cars at a hotel or
It
something.
needs to be wrong.
All right. We're going to switch gears a little bit today. I was going to talk about Romans, but there's still some things in this Ephesus chapter that we haven't really gotten around to. I'm going to start with 3 things, and this is relevant. Anybody know what this show is? I stumbled across this. It's from 1999 to like 2002 or 3. Sci-fi-ish, like a rip-off of Star Trek, Star Wars kind of thing. But at one point, so I watched a few of it. It's not very good. But you're flipping through all those things now, and but it's actually very creative in a lot of ways, and a lot of the characters are done by the Jim Henson Company, the Muppets, and so it kind of has this. It's an interesting feel to it. There are things about it that are really clever. The writing's terrible, and it's just. I'm just about done with it after a handful of episodes. I don't think I can do all however many seasons. But at one point, the Earthling, who is through sci-fi stuff, cast way out to like the far side of the galaxy, first human ever. And so he's encountering new species and things. But at one point, he crash lands in their adventures on a planet that has never seen an alien before. And so then he's the first alien they've ever seen. And at one point, he has this conversation with the woman and her son that kind of help him about, he says, when all of a sudden you have this encounter, it shapes everything you know religiously and your ideas about God and religion and creation. And it's like, it's this little, like, one line, and I was like, well, no, that would be really interesting. They of course don't pursue that. You know, it's just not good enough for them to actually take advantage of something like that. But he says it. And so which of course in this story, he's the only human that's ever had that experience. Like, he's the only human. But he says, and it's true, right? These people, they don't know what to make of this, right? So the army comes and all that stuff. They want to capture the aliens and things like that. Of course, the human is the alien. But it's that idea that exposure to a previously unknown being threatens your religious beliefs. That what you knew about the way things were is upset with the introduction of kind of a new something out there. And so that's going to become relevant. The show itself is forgettable. Don't worry about it. But I came across it this past week or two, and I just thought that one conversation kind of reminded me of what we're going to talk about here today. All right, so that's number 1. 2, since we talked about the Muppets there, what do Jim Henson, who made the Muppets, and Len Bias, and me, what do we all have in common? Ooh, well, that is true. Do you know who Len Bias is? Do you remember that story?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Okay. We all went to the same high school in Maryland. That is irrelevant, but the Muppets thing made me think of it. All right, and 3, completely irrelevant. All right, so there's a whole lot here. I've used this slide before. These are the supernatural features in the biblical accounts of the birth of Jesus. Mainly from Luke and Matthew, and then one from Isaiah at the top. And there's a whole lot there. I put this together. I had to get it all in one slide because there's a lot. The virgin birth, and then here's the thing. Gabriel, the angel, appears twice to Zechariah and Mary. We have an unnamed angel that appears to Joseph. Angels appear to the shepherds, of course, when Jesus is born. The wise men are led by a star to Jerusalem. Now, of course, back in when we were talking about Daniel, we talked about the idea that a lot of people think that the wise men in this story are people in Babylon who kind of were influenced by, when Daniel and the other kind of aristocratic, well-educated people became part of that group of scholars there during the captivity, that's where Babylon got those scriptures and those traditions, and so that's how they knew, people who had been studying those for the past few hundred years, knew to be looking out for these signs, which is kind of interesting. But a star leads them to Jerusalem, right? We have a lot of dreams. The wise men are, they have a dream, don't go back to Herod. And then Joseph keeps getting, angels in dreams saying, go to Egypt, go back to Egypt, or go back to, leave Egypt. And then says, well, don't go back to Jerusalem, you need to go up to Nazareth. Yeah.
I saw a video reel this week where a person was listing a number of the prophecies concerning Christ that were made over hundreds of years or maybe even 1,000 years ago.
Mhm.
And they gave the probability of one person being able to actually fulfill those prophecies. And it was infinitesimally small, far less than winning the lottery. It was just almost an impossible number for one person to actually meet those prophecies or fulfill those prophecies.
Yeah. Especially when you take it to the supernatural elements of that, it'd be
Well,
even
just
smaller.
Born in Jerusalem.
The one person would actually do all those things?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's it. And we've talked about some of those prophecies, especially when we were talking about Daniel and things like that. There were these things that, in hindsight, can appear kind of clear as far as what they point to. I mean, you got to do some digging. But it's also easy to see how a whole lot of people missed it at the time. But yeah, it really is a neat idea that the wise men knew what they knew to look out for the prophecies that they were looking out for because of the time that Daniel and company were there during the Babylonian exile, and so all those prophecies, those scriptures, that's when the Babylonian experts were exposed to them. If indeed that's accurate, we don't know. They came from the east, but quite a few people think that scholars, people smarter than me, they think that makes sense, right? Wise men from the east who knew this. Well, that Babylon was still a center for learning and things like that.
How many wise men were there?
Well, in all the things I've seen, there's three. There's 2 white guys and a black guy. Sometimes there's, an Asian and a white guy and a black guy. Well, all the nativity scenes can't be wrong. So
There were 3 gifts.
there are 3 gifts, yeah.
3 gifts.
So how'd you like to be that 4th magi? You didn't have a gift. Like the other 3 actually got to hand him something.
Or maybe 2 of them brought gold.
Well, I guess that's true. Anyway, all right. Supernatural stuff that, we're celebrating this time of year. And throughout the story of the birth of Christ, you can't get from one part of the story to the next without something supernatural happening. Right? So it's not even just the virgin birth, obviously miracle enough. And, she gives birth and then the story goes on. Every step of the way, we have something that we have to make this leap of faith if we're going to, buy the story. And so that is relevant to what we want to talk about. So, Johnny, last week you asked a question, basically asking something about what Paul says, if Paul ever does really talk about God's, other gods out there and things like that. Does he confirm that he believes in these things or not? So I wanted to kind of go down a little rabbit hole with that a little bit because I think it's relevant.
Could I rephrase that? From what
It's set in stone now. Like you are bound to this.
You said I asked the question. Are you saying I asked that question?
Close to it. I'm paraphrasing.
I was, of course.
Revise your question, then I'll just throw in the whole
no,
message.
I was just saying behind the idols.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that.
Similar, but yes, sorry.
Similar. If I misquoted you.
No, just I was saying, when he saw an idol,
Yeah.
he recognized not that there were other gods, because the Elohim are gods,
Mhm.
but were there gods behind the false idols?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Okay.
So here was a random question that came to my mind that nobody actually asked last week, but it was related to a very relevant question that somebody did ask. So if we go back to what we've been talking about this semester, we have several times that Paul is kind of engaging in and kind of navigating the world of this Greco-Roman world that is full of belief in gods and things like this. So of course we get in Lystra when he's mistaken to be one of the gods and they want to make sacrifices to them. And when he's talking to them, he says, turn from these vain things to a living God. And different versions, this is the ESV, say it a little bit differently, but living God is a common term that the translations that a lot of us use there. Yep.
Do you know the backstory of why these people would be so inclined to think they were gods?
Yeah, we talked about there was a myth at the time about Zeus and Hermes visiting the area, and the people that did not welcome them were all killed in a flood. And then there's one poor couple that didn't have anything, lived in a little shanty shack. They invite them in, and so they are spared from the death, and they're actually made a priest and a priestess at the temple of Zeus. And so that's part of the mythology of this area. It wasn't this town, it wasn't Lystra, but it was in that region where that happened in the distant past, but they would have known the story. It's in Ovid and some other ancient writings. Not that they weren't reading Ovid, but the story was floating around there. So it makes sense that they wanted to sacrifice them because last time the god showed up and we didn't treat him well, they killed everyone. So it kind of makes it, in their line of thinking, it makes perfect sense. But a living God, turn from these vain things to a living God, as if the things you're worshiping are not living, which is how we could read that. All right, so when he's in Philippi, that was on his first missionary trip. The second missionary trip, he's in Philippi. We talked about the young girl that is possessed and she's following them around. And, she's saying these men are servants of the Most High God. She's, talking about Paul and company. At this point, Silas and Timothy are with him, right? Paul says to the Spirit, this is how Luke records it. He said to the Spirit, I command you in the name of Jesus to come out of her. And so, Paul obviously he didn't just say it, he didn't talk to the girl, he addressed the spirit that was in her. When he's in Athens, and he sees the shrine to the unnamed God, and he has that kind of sermon that he gives to Areopagus. The God who made the world and everything in it, who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands. So again, it's this idea that this God is different in nature than these other gods that you all here in Athens currently are worshiping. And then we have him here in Ephesus. Greg talked about this. The complaint against him, some of these tradesmen, Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And this is kind of where that question comes from. So they make the idols. The market for idols is decreasing as faith in God is increasing. And again, this is what one of their complaints against Paul is. So we don't know how much they're trying to tweak what he has said in order to convince people to be on their side. But it's still the idea that gods made with hands are not gods. It is easy to think that from some of these passages, we're going to look at a few others, that there are no other gods other than God, right? And then it's easy to think from some, like he's talking to a spirit that's inside this woman. It's like, okay, there is something else out there. So this is, again, Greg talked a little bit about this. Idolaters did not believe that their idols were the deities that were from the supernatural world. So nobody thought that the little wooden or silver or any other kind of metal sculpture of Artemis or whoever was Artemis. Like they knew that was the people are making them there in their little, sheds, that they're selling, so they can see where they're coming from. But what they believed is two things. One of two things or both things. One, that it represents that deity. And so if you want to pay homage to this deity, to Artemis, to Zeus, whoever, they're out there somewhere up on Mount Olympus or soaring around somewhere in the cosmos. So we have something to represent them. They also, many believed, that those idols became kind of inhabited by the god. And the way, kind of the parallel to that, for us to think of that, is the Ark of the Covenant. Not that these are on the same playing field or anything like that. But the same idea, right? So the god inhabits this physical structure, this thing. And so in that sense, those idols are very important, right? Because whoever the god is actually dwelling in there. And of course, there's lots of these idols everywhere, especially in Ephesus. That's the complaint. It's kind of like if you go to places, the best one, if you've ever been to Paris and you go to the Eiffel Tower, and there are just hordes of, they're all African migrants, and they have big quilts just laid out with every size cheap replica of the Eiffel Tower, like little metal and plastic. There's a billion of them. They got them on keychains, and then the cops show up and they wrap the thing, they all run away, and then they put it back down 30 feet away, outsmarting the cops. And you can't get near the Eiffel Tower without being accosted to buy some of these. So they're everywhere. It's not like the people in Ephesus said, "Oh, I have the one idol that Artemis lives in." Everybody else has one also, but they still believe that the god inhabited that. A lot of people believe that. And so that makes this complaint against Paul pretty serious, right? But yeah, no one thought that the idol itself was the god. It represents the god, or it's a dwelling place for the god. Paul elsewhere, this famous passage, right? Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. So again, this is Paul to this church in Ephesus. The letter he writes to them, very much addressing the situation they're in, right? The temple to Artemis, the gods are everywhere. The worship of the gods, not just Artemis, the worship of all the gods is everywhere. And he's talking about the fact that that's who we are fighting against, are the ones that you're worshiping. Yeah, that's our real battle. Our real battle is not against, the mayor and the governor and the emperor of Rome. It's those beings that actually inhabit those idols that people around you are worshiping. Right? This is real to the church of Ephesians when he writes this. He's saying that those spirits, those gods, those spiritual beings, that's who we're actually fighting against. So again, very much, just kind of, he's not even trying to prove that there are other spiritual beings out there. He's just taking it for granted there are. That's who actually we're fighting against. 2 Corinthians, the same thing. For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh, right? For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power, right? So we're in this spiritual battle with spiritual beings. It's hard for us to fathom, right? But this is just, the world is, as Paul sees it, as a lot of other people here are seeing it. Of course, Danny and TJ used this verse, recently in their sermon series about mental health and spiritual warfare and things like that. Now, 1 Corinthians complicates this a little bit, and this is one of the verses that becomes difficult for us to understand exactly the nature of these other gods and whether or not they exist. Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, and this is to the church, the letter he writes to the church in Corinth, which also had lots and lots of idols and things. They're the ones that had the temple to, not Artemis, Aphrodite. Right? So they had all the temple prostitutes everywhere and things like that. As to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist. He says, but some through former association with idols, not God's idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. Food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. So,
That passage comes as close to making that direct connection to a man-made idol as any of them.
for
The
although
others
there are many
the others
so-called gods.
that we've looked at say, yes, there are bad Elohim.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as its association to a handmade idol, that comes
Yeah.
pretty darn close.
Yeah. So if we look at it, talk about Elohim and things, our guy that we have come back to a lot of times, Michael Heiser, he thinks that so-called gods is a bad translation. And if you listen to his little podcast about it, it makes sense. He said this is the exact same word that's being translated that elsewhere is just called. Not so-called, it's just called. And he said, but here translators have decided to translate it as so-called gods. Again, translations, that's not an easy thing, right? According to Heiser, it should read like this. For although there are many gods in heaven and on earth that are called gods, and indeed there are many gods and lords, yet for us there's one, that are called God. I mean, he's saying that if we just interpret it the way it's written, it reads like that. There are many gods on earth and heaven that are called gods. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There are many gods in heaven and on earth that are called gods. Okay, it's a difficult verse. It's a difficult verse to translate. It's difficult for us to understand when he says it's so-called God. That obviously implies that these aren't real things. They're just so-called gods. And so this is one of those verses that hurts. But 2 chapters later, same letter to the Corinthians. That was chapter 8. This is chapter 10. He's still talking about food offered to idols. He says, what do I imply? That food offered to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No. I imply that what pagans sacrifice They offer to demons and not to God. That is the ESV, same translation that we just read. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. So this is pretty clear that
Yeah, it's-
there are spiritual forces involved in this. Right? These are not so-called demons. He's saying you can't be involved in this sacrifice because there are demons. There are these other gods, other spiritual forces who are here. And we cannot participate in the worship of them. But I mean, the implications are there. These aren't just like made up gods that people are just trying to understand the universe, so they make up some gods. I mean, Paul keeps, well, there really are these spiritual forces out there. Yeah.
So are we equating demons with gods? Or where we went back and the demon was cast out by Paul, but they referred to him as God?
Well, yes,
Okay.
in a way.
Okay.
If we refer to them as other supernatural spiritual beings, if we think of them that way, the word God throws us off because we call God God. And so when we say God's plural, we naturally are thinking there are multiples of the one we worship. And that's not accurate. But according to Paul, Michael Heiser definitely, there are plenty of other beings out there,
Well,
spiritual beings.
the Hebrew word for a celestial being in the spiritual realm is Elohim.
Mm.
But there is one creator Elohim, big G.
Yep.
So we interpret that Hebrew word, little g God.
Yeah, he's the superior of all the gods, the bestest of the best, the most powerful, the transcendent, the one who is not created. And again, if we get into the Michael Heiser, if you were to get into Michael Heiser books that he's written about this, he takes us through all the Old Testament verses and things. They were created. God, our capital G God, Yahweh, was not. He always has been. And so they're subordinate to him, but they are spiritual beings. And they have power and things like that. What he's saying, though, is in 1 Corinthians, in that letter of 1 Corinthians, he makes it pretty clear what he's talking about, right? He's not offering a proof or disproof of the existence of spiritual beings. That's not what he's trying to do. He's taking for granted there are spiritual beings out there, and there's worship of them. So what he's saying, we can't, Christians cannot participate in the worship of these things, no matter what, because we can't. That we worship one God, our God. And we should avoid eating food that's been sacrificed to an idol if it's a stumbling block to people. So, I mean, if it tempts someone to fall back into the worship of gods, and that's, for us, it's like, how do you just like backslide into worshiping other gods? But we're talking about a culture that is converting people from that practice, right? So in Corinth and Ephesus, these are people that they sacrifice in their homes, or they don't sacrifice in their homes. They worship other gods in their homes. They have little idols in their homes, in the public square, at the temples. It is part of everyday life. The gods are everywhere. And so it's just part of identity. It's part of how you understand the world to work. And Paul and coming here converting people out of that to not participate in that at all. And so there'd be a lot of cultural and social expectations there to go to that temple and worship, to offer sacrifices, probably among your family if they haven't converted, right? So he's saying, if you're going to call someone to fall back into that lifestyle, then don't eat that meat that's sacrificed to idols. If someone who is converted to Christianity is having trouble, help them out. Like, avoid that meat. So, or if it's going to tempt you to fall back, because some of these people themselves were converts, then avoid it. Don't go buy that food if all of a sudden you get your hands on it and you kind of just want to kind of get back into that practice, that lifestyle. I mean, it's just a cultural thing. But if it's not if nobody's being tempted to fall back into idol worship, then it doesn't matter. And I guess at that point, it's just meat, right? Yeah, so here's what we say. the ones sacrificing idols were sacrificing to the gods that those idols represented, or the gods that inhabited those idols. But their worship of those gods was as real to them as our worship of God is to us. And when I say as real to them as it is to us, well, just here this morning in Campbell Street, how real our worship is, how real God is. There's going to be a wide range of people, that scale of how faithful are you feeling right now. Some people are not shaken at all, and they believe wholeheartedly. Other people really struggle with it. There's a real range. The same is true in the Greco-Roman world. When was Plato? 300 years at least. The idea that maybe these gods don't exist, maybe there are no gods, was a prevalent thing that came from Plato and people like that. There are plenty of people in this world that were questioning the nature of the gods and the validity of worshiping these gods. Just like nowadays, there are plenty of people that say, I don't know, it's all just made up, right? There are people back then, but the ones who are there making these sacrifices, it's real to them. They're worshiping real gods, and with Paul, the way he's describing it, they are worshiping real spiritual beings. We don't want to call them gods. They really are participating in the worship of a being. We can't see them, but they're not just figments of their imagination. For us, all those Greek and Roman gods are just material for like Disney cartoons at this point. And it's fun. All those stories are fun, right? But these are real gods that had, could provide different things for different people. So, does he ever affirm or say anything about the existence of God? Yeah. In multiple places, he's talking about, Corinthians, Ephesians, Acts. He's directly talking about this idea of the existence of other gods and the fact that they're active. We are battling against them. People are worshiping them. And so this is not just like there's some dead gods out there, some idea. These are very active beings. How's that? Does that help at all?
Well, the First Corinthians 10 answers the question I asked.
Okay, good. Well, I waste a lot of time. All right, let's go back a step before the riot in Ephesus that Greg talked about last week. Here we are still in Paul's third missionary journey. This is from an N.T. Wright book that I've been using quite a bit this kind of semester, talking about the gods and how they worship them. And we've talked about this before. One of the things about the pagan world is their gods help them now. Ideas about the afterlife varied widely. We've even seen that with the Pharisees and the Sadducees among the Jews. But the pagan gods out there are for right now. They're not for the afterlife. There's no like heaven that you're promised. They had a lot of very varying ideas about the afterlife, but one thing that was very consistent was that worshiping all these gods helped you here and now. If you're sick, if you wanted to have kids, if you wanted the crops to grow, if you whatever. Wanted to make some money, you wanted to curse someone. The gods are for that. Helps us right here and right now. And that's what paganism and, neo-pagans in America are still into that. It's what helps you right now. And also, and this is an important thing when we talk about the New Testament world, Greco-Roman religion was concerned not with creedal beliefs about gods, but with cultic acts. So the worship itself that demonstrated devotion to these deities. So what you actually believed about them, that varied pretty widely. I mean, lots of cultures, we're talking about bringing in gods from lots of different cultures in the Mediterranean world. People believe different things about them, and different areas, kind of had their gods they worship more closely. This Ephesus was the main Artemis temple, but there are other smaller shrines or temples to Artemis all over the place, but the main one's there. And so you had a lot of that. Athena in Athens, right? I mean, it's named after the Parthenon. But it's how you actually did that. Because if we're going to the temple and we're making these sacrifices, and everybody can see that we're all making these sacrifices, then we can see that we're doing what the gods want us to do, and so that they'll be good to us. I don't know what's in your heart. I don't know what you really think about these things. But get that chicken and go cut its head off in the temple, you know? It's like, so that we're going through the actions, right? Going through the motions. They cared a lot about that. This is a letter to the person who would become Augustus Caesar, from one of his kind of mentors earlier. You should not only worship the divine in everywhere and in every way in accordance with our ancestral traditions, but also force all others to honor it. Those who attempt to distort our religion with strange rites, you should hate and punish, not only for the sake of the gods, but also because such people, by bringing in new divinities, persuade many folks to adopt foreign practices, which leads to conspiracies, revolts, and factions which are entirely unsuitable for monarchy, right? So we've talked about this before. The Roman world liked order. This is why the Jews are expelled from Rome at least 3 times around these years, twice before Jesus died. So it had nothing to do with Christianity. It was just because these Jews were not worshiping the right way. They refused. And so we kick them out of Rome, you let them back in, you kick them out. And then, of course, they do get kicked out. That's where Priscilla and Aquila come from. They're part of the group of Jews that's kicked out of Rome. And we have that evidence that someone named Christus was part of the problem. And people think, well, whoever was writing that was not a Christian. Christus is Christ. And they just thought it was he is a person, but they thought Christus was still there physically doing something, but it was all the problems between the Jews and the new Christians because of the belief in Christ. And said, that's some Christ guy. Kick them out. They're unruly. They're not worshiping the right way. So, their ancestral traditions, worshiping these other gods, Zeus and Artemis and Athena and the whole gang, Poseidon, that's the ancestral traditional worship. Christianity is the new thing that's really, really weird because they don't worship all those other gods. They just worship one God. Like you might go make your sacrifice to Artemis a lot. If you live in Ephesus, that's your main deity. But you've got tons of other deities with shrines and temples all over the place, including in your own house. And there's obviously a temple and a shrine to the current emperor, because they all thought they were gods and needed to be worshipped, right? And so you'd be worshiping a lot of people, even if Artemis was your main gal, right? And same thing if you're in Athens, Athena is your main person. Christianity was the weird thing that did not conform to tradition. And that's hard for us to imagine because Christianity has been the status quo religion for centuries and centuries in the Western world. That was not the case there. So you got to watch out for these strange new things that just upset everything. And that's what monarchy never wants, is things that upset anything. Political leaders wanted peace and security, and religion was one way to bring that about, right? Everybody doing the same thing, worshiping the same gods. The gods themselves would be happy and help us out. And religion was not a separate thing. It wasn't like, well, what's your religion? What's your religion? What's your religion? And then you go to your job Monday through Friday, and your religion has nothing to do with that, the way our world is today. Religion and life, professional life, civic life, it was all one and the same. There was no separation. It's similar to, say, medieval or Renaissance Europe, where Christianity was, you didn't have another religion. Everybody was Christian. But that wasn't thought of being, you're special. There was like the Moors and the Muslims and things that lived way far away, and they were heathens and pagans. Who knows what they are? But we didn't. If you're walking around France or England or Italy or someplace during medieval times, it wasn't like religion was separate from every other aspect of life. It was all one and the same. And that's how the ancient world was too. Different than how we think of religion. It infused every aspect of life. The word religion wasn't a word back then. They didn't have a word to separate religious belief from life and belief and things like that. That came up, that starts later in time, to kind of think of, this philosophy about where we came from, we're going to call that religion. Because before that, it was just as central to what you know about anything as anything else. Didn't have its own category. So when someone like Paul goes to Thessalonica or Ephesus talk about one God and his son who was killed, which is not the way most cultures want to think about the God they want to worship, but he was defeated and killed. He was not offering an alternative way of being religious in the sense of a private hobby, something to do a few hours at the weekend. He was offering a heart transplant for an entire community and its culture. Radical, radical, radical. And so, as he says, it's hardly surprising that you have riots on all the missionary trips. Because Paul's saying things that just do not jive with the culture of the time. In the Roman world, they had lots of gods coming from lots of places. They incorporated lots of God from lots of places into their worship. But not everything goes. One of the charges against Socrates is that he was introducing new, what we would call religious belief. Strange practices and beliefs in the gods. That's one of the reasons Socrates was forced to commit suicide. Now, that was also a very political thing, but that was one of the formal charges against him. So it's not like the Greek world was like, oh yeah, any god's fine. They brought in a lot of gods, but those gods needed to conform to some ways to the way culture already existed. And most of the gods did. And you got to think some of these conquered nations who had different gods, they made their gods conform real fast, right? Like once the Romans showed up, it's like, hey, you're one of our territories now. It's like, oh, this is the way we worship too. And their gods all of a sudden perfectly conform to the way the Romans like to worship. But not always. Christianity just didn't go. It didn't work well with it. It just doesn't mix. All right, so real quick. We read this before. So this is Paul in Ephesus. As he entered the city, he goes to the synagogue as always. They don't really listen, so he takes it perhaps to that very building right there. It's really kind of neat. I've never been there. But, and he stays there 2 years preaching in Ephesus. It says, and God was doing extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, so that even handkerchiefs or aprons that had touched his skin were carried away to the sick, and their diseases left them, and the evil spirits came out of them, which is strange. So 2 years, right, in this culture that is so infused with gods and worship of gods of all sorts. And it became known, like this is these extraordinary miracles. You try to he's eating lunch and he wipes his hand on a napkin and throws it away at McDonald's and he's like, oh, I want that napkin, right? And all of a sudden you go heal someone by touching it. It's unfathomable for us. Like I can't imagine this, right? I mean, I have to only imagine it. I believe it, but it's strange. So people know about this, right? Then some of the itinerant Jewish exorcists undertook to invoke the name of the Lord Jesus over those who had evil spirits, saying, I adjure you by the Jesus whom Paul proclaimed. So itinerant Jewish exorcists. So they're obviously Jewish, and they probably are trying to, make their way in this world of the gods, in the marketplace of the gods. And being an exorcist was a job. And we've already seen a different place, right? Paul casts a demon out of the young girl. Jesus does that during his ministry. So here they are, and what they're trying to do is, it's not me, but that guy Paul, whatever he's saying, yeah, say that to you. Come out of that. It's like, oh, smack him on the head. Trying to claim Jesus, whom Paul proclaimed, right? It's like secondary exorcisms. It's like, yeah, Paul's over there, but I'll say the same magic words, and the demon will come out. 7 sons of a Jewish high priest named Siva were doing this. Now, we actually know the names. I don't know off the top of my head. Historians know all the high priests at this time in Jerusalem. Their records. Siva was not one of them. This probably means he had become kind of a high priest of either a complete pagan religion or a really wide offshoot from Judaism here in Ephesus, where they've merged some of their Jewish traditions with some of these practices and beliefs, in the other gods, which is part of what Paul's talking about, which is why that makes perfect sense, that you have some Jews here in Ephesus that have this kind of strange mixed up religion between Judaism and paganism. I mean, Paul's fighting against that, so here they are. So he had sons. He was not a Jewish high priest in Jerusalem. Perhaps he was important, who knows? But the evil spirit answered them, these 7 sons, Jesus I know, and Paul I recognize, but who are you? And then we have the great battle royale, right? And the man in whom was the evil spirit leaped on them, mastered all of them, and overpowered them so that they fled out of that house naked and wounded. So they're trying to use the language that Paul uses, trying to, in the name of Jesus, we cast you out. And once again, this happens, with that possessed girl in Philippi. She's walking around saying, hey, these guys are proclaiming the one true God. The evil spirit in her knew it. And the evil spirit here, it's like, I know Jesus and I know Paul. I don't know you, and you're going to pay for that. It's like, so he beats them up. Running naked from the house would also be very embarrassing for any of us, but especially if your job is to be the exorcist. And you go in and say, we got this. And 7 of them march in. They got, it's like all the Catholic movies now with the cross and all the people doing their little exorcist stuff. And then they instead come like flying out of the house naked. Like, you got to think business is bad after that. Everybody sees this. Like, I might go to Paul instead of the sons of Steve. And this became known to all the residents of Ephesus, which is, again, those 7 guys they got to move on. This became known. What happened there became known in all of Ephesus, right? So both Jews and Greeks. And fear fell upon them all, and the name of the Lord Jesus was extolled. Also, many of those who were now believers came, confessing and divulging their practices. Believers came. They heard this. And a number of those believers who were coming forth saying, I'm messing this up. I'm worshiping these other gods also. A number of those who had practiced magic arts brought their books together and burned them in the sight of all. And they counted the value of them and found it came to 50,000 pieces of silver. So the word of the Lord continued to increase and prevail mightily. So when Paul's talking, what we just talked about eating food sacrificed to idols, and that being a stumbling block, these are the people. The worship of these gods, the magic, everything about it, is hard to avoid for them. It's their world. It's how they know the world operates. Everything that they've been taught, everything culture teaches. That's the traditional view. It's what their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents did, right? These are the ones worshiping the gods are the ones holding fast to the old religion. A lot of us now, it's like, I want the old-time religion. I want it to come back. The religion of my childhood. Everybody wants a religion. You have a time frame in your childhood. That was the best time for religion. If only church could be just like that. We all think that, right? We have this that's what they're doing. They're hearkening back to the good old days. The way Grandma and Grandpa used to worship when they went to the Temple of Artemis. It's Christianity that's different. And for a lot of them, they're doing both. Just like the sons of Sceva are kind of like combining Judaism and pagan worship or something like that. We don't really know. But they hear about this and they realize, okay, we got to get straight on this. Because look what just happened. And so they burn it.
Whatever you do, don't confront one of those evil spirits.
Yeah, it's like, okay, you do what you will. Books were not as easily produced 2,000 years ago as they are today. You may not know that. Burning books is a big deal. We talk about the library in Alexandria that burns down and all this knowledge of the ancient world is gone. For them to bring, this is a lot of money that they're talking about. For people to bring books, now these would have been books about the gods, the nature of the gods, how to worship the gods, how to use them to cast spells or something. This is a big sacrifice, especially if it's something that you do also. It's like, I go listen to Paul. I believe in Jesus. That sounds good, but I'm still going to make my sacrifices to Artemis and Zeus and Bacchus and all the others because they do good things for me too. And all of a sudden that realization, right? So what's it like to throw that? If you only had one Bible, take it to the town square and burn it, because that's the only one you were ever going to have. That's a big deal. That's a big sacrifice. But that's the sacrifice they're making here. But it also points to this real conflict in this Greco-Roman world between our God, the God that Paul's preaching, and all these other gods and the worship of these gods that's out there. I mean, there's
Something was
Yeah.
interesting. I watched this past week a series on, it was called The Fall of the City. It was the Trojan-Spartan Wars. And they took if they wanted to know what the gods wanted them to do, they went to a priest. The priest could communicate with the gods.
Mhm.
The individuals, the kings, the soldiers, whatever, could not communicate with the gods, but the priest did. So when they went to worship at the temples or whatever, the priest would tell them what the God said for them to do.
Yeah.
Well, in this situation, I think they're looking maybe at Paul in a similar light, since he can communicate with God, the real God. They're looking at him to tell them what they should do. So that's why they give him such deference and reverence.
All right, we're out of time, so make sure you tell Danny that we did have his idol here, and that we worshiped this morning, oversaw our class. All right, thanks. See you next. Greg has next week. Next week's the last week of class before the break.
I don't even.
Oh, no. Oh, no.